The morning sun cut through the tall windows of Hartwell Conservatory, casting long golden shadows across the marble floors. Students walked through the halls with their heads held high. Some carried violin cases. Others held folders stuffed with sheet music. They talked about composers and symphonies, about summer programs in Europe and private lessons with famous teachers. This was a place for dreamers, but it was also a place where dreams were measured by money, by connections, by the right last name. And then there was May. She stood outside the main entrance that September morning, her hands gripping a small bag. She was 32 years old. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a gray sweater that had seen better days and shoes that were starting to come apart at the soles. She did not look like someone who belonged here, and she knew it. For a long moment, she just stood there, watching. Students laughed and greeted each other like old friends. A young man stepped out of a sleek black car, his father handing him a brand new leather bag. A girl in an expensive coat talked loudly about her trip to Paris. May felt her chest tighten. She thought about turning around. She thought about walking back to the bus stop, riding home, and forgetting this whole thing. But she didn't. She took a deep breath and walked through the doors. The adult piano program was on the third floor. It was a smaller program, mostly made up of people who had the time and money to pick up a hobby. Retired lawyers, bored housewives, a few young professionals who wanted to impress their friends at dinner parties. May did not fit into any of these groups. She cleaned hotel rooms for a living. She worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. She had saved for 2 years just to afford the tuition for this program. When she walked into the classroom, the other students barely looked at her. A few glanced up, then looked away. She found a seat at the very back of the room and sat down quietly. She placed her bag on the floor and folded her hands in her lap. She did not speak to anyone. She did not try to introduce herself. The teacher arrived a few minutes later. His name was Professor David Thornton. He was a tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes. He had once been a concert pianist himself, or so the rumors said. Now he taught at the conservatory, and he made sure everyone knew he was doing them a favor by being there. He stood at the front of the room and looked over the class. His eyes moved from face to face, sizing each person up in seconds. When his gaze landed on May, it paused. Just for a moment, she saw something flicker in his expression. Doubt, maybe even disappointment. Then, he looked away. "Let's begin with introductions," he said. "Tell me your name, your background, and what you hope to achieve in this program." One by one, the students spoke. A woman in her 40s talked about her years of childhood lessons and her dream to finally master Chopin. A young man mentioned his music degree from a good university. Another student name-dropped a famous teacher she had studied with in London. Each introduction was more impressive than the last. Each one seemed designed to prove something. Then it was May's turn. She stood up slowly. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her. Her heart pounded in her chest. "My name is May," she said quietly. "I don't have a background in music. I just want to learn." That was all she said. She sat back down. Professor Thornton stared at her for a long moment. Then, he sighed. It was a small sound, but May heard it clearly. It said everything. It said she did not belong here. It said she was wasting his time. "Very well," he said. "We'll start you with the basics." He handed her a thin book of beginner exercises. Scales. Simple finger drills. The kind of thing you would give to a child, just learning to find the keys. The other students received advanced pieces. 1-2. 1-2. Complicated compositions. May looked down at her little book and said nothing. The class went on. Professor Thornton spent most of his time with the other students, correcting their technique, praising their progress. He barely looked at May. When he did walk past her, he would glance at her hands and frown. Her fingers were not smooth and soft like the others. They were rough. The skin was thick with calluses. The hands of someone who scrubbed floors and changed sheets and carried heavy loads. "You'll need to work on your hand care," he said once, almost in passing. May nodded. She did not explain. She did not tell him that her hands looked this way because she worked 12-hour shifts. She did not tell him that she could not afford fancy creams or manicures. She just nodded and kept practicing her scales. The weeks went by. May came to every class. She arrived before anyone else and stayed after everyone left. She sat in the same seat at the back of the room. She never raised her hand. She never asked questions. She listened. She watched. She practiced her simple exercises over and over again while the others played beautiful, complex pieces. The other students started to talk. They whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Some of them laughed. One of them, a young man whose family had donated a lot of money to the conservatory, was the cruelest. He called her names behind her back. He made jokes about her clothes, her hands, her silence. He wondered out loud why someone like her was even allowed in the program. May heard all of it. She pretended not to. But here is what none of them knew. Every night, May went home to a tiny apartment on the edge of the city. It had one room, a small kitchen, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. There was no piano. She could not afford one. She could barely afford the rent. But on her kitchen table, there was something strange. A long piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, taped down flat. On that paper, she had drawn a piano keyboard. Every key, every black and white rectangle, perfectly measured, perfectly spaced. And every night, after her shift at the hotel, May would sit at that table. She would place her tired, aching fingers on that paper keyboard, and she would play. She would play for hours. Her fingers moving across the silent keys. No sound. No music. Just the feeling of her hands remembering something they had never forgotten. She played scales. She played arpeggios. She played pieces so complex that most professional pianists struggled with them, all on a piece of paper, all in complete silence. Her neighbors never heard a thing. Her co-workers never knew. The students at the conservatory never imagined. Sometimes, May would play until 2 or 3 in the morning. Her fingers would cramp. Her eyes would burn. But she did not stop. She could not stop, because somewhere deep inside her, beneath all the exhaustion and the doubt and the quiet shame of being looked down on, there was something that refused to die. It was a fire that had been burning for 20 years. And no amount of silence could put it out. So when Professor Thornton looked at her and saw nothing, when the other students laughed at her rough hands and her cheap clothes, when the whole world told her she did not belong, May just smiled softly to herself. Because they had no idea. They had no idea what those fingers could really do. 2 months passed. The leaves outside the conservatory turned gold and red, then brown, then fell away completely. Winter crept into the city. The mornings grew cold and dark, and inside that third-floor classroom, nothing had changed for May. She still sat at the back. She still arrived early and left late. She still practiced her simple beginner exercises while everyone else played pieces that filled the room with sound. And Professor Thornton still looked right through her like she wasn't even there. But something was changing. Not in the classroom. In the whispers. The other students had grown bolder. At first, they only talked about her when she wasn't around. Now they barely tried to hide it. They would glance at her and smirk. They would make comments just loud enough for her to hear. The young man, whose family had donated money to the school, was the worst of them all. He had a way of making cruelty sound like a joke. "Look at her hands," he said one day to a group of students near the door. "They look like she's been scrubbing toilets her whole life." The others laughed. May was only a few feet away. She heard every word. She said nothing. She just kept her eyes on the keys in front of her. "I heard she works at some cheap motel," another student added. "Cleaning rooms. Can you imagine?" And she thinks she can play piano? More laughter. May's fingers trembled slightly, but she did not look up. She played her scale again. C major, the simplest thing in the world, over and over, like it was the only thing that mattered. Professor Thornton heard the laughter. He saw the students looking at May, but he did nothing. He turned back to his desk and shuffled some papers. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he agreed with them. May never knew for sure. But his silence told her everything she needed to know. She was alone here. Completely alone. The midterm evaluations came in November. Every student would receive a written assessment from Professor Thornton. It would determine whether they could continue in the program or whether they would be asked to leave. Most students weren't worried. They came from good backgrounds. They had experience. They had connections. The evaluation was just a formality for them. For May, it was everything. She had sacrificed so much to be here. She had worked double shifts for months. She had skipped meals to save money. She had given up every small comfort just to afford the tuition. If she was asked to leave now, all of it would be for nothing. The evaluations were handed out at the end of class on a gray Friday afternoon. Professor Thornton walked around the room, placing a sealed envelope on each student's desk. When he reached May, he paused. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his eyes. Not kindness. Something closer to pity. Or maybe resignation. He placed the envelope on her desk and walked away without a word. May waited until class was over. She waited until all the other students had left. She waited until she was completely alone in that empty room, with the winter light fading outside the windows. Then, she opened the envelope. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs, but the words hit her like stones. After careful observation, it read, "I regret to inform you that I am recommending your withdrawal from the program. Despite your attendance and effort, you have shown no meaningful progress. Your technique remains undeveloped. Your musical instincts are absent. Some individuals simply do not possess the natural ability required for serious piano study. Your hands, in particular, lack the delicacy and sensitivity that this instrument demands. I believe your time and resources would be better spent elsewhere. I wish you well in your future endeavors." May read the letter 3 times. Each time, the words cut deeper. Your hands lack delicacy. Some individuals simply do not possess the natural ability. Your time would be better spent elsewhere. She folded the letter carefully. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. But inside, something was breaking. All those nights at her kitchen table, all those hours pressing silent keys on a piece of paper, all the dreams she had carried for so long, none of it mattered. To them, she was just a cleaning lady who didn't belong. She put the letter in her pocket and stood up. She gathered her things, slowly. She walked out of the classroom, down the marble stairs, through the grand entrance hall. Students passed her, without a glance. The security guard at the front desk didn't even look up. She stepped outside into the cold November air. The sky was heavy with clouds. A few snowflakes drifted down, landing on her coat, on her hair, on the ground, at her feet. She stood there for a long moment, just breathing. Part of her wanted to cry. Part of her wanted to scream. Part of her wanted to march back inside and tell Professor Thornton exactly who she was and what she could do. But she didn't. She just stood there in the falling snow, feeling the weight of the letter in her pocket. Then she started walking toward the bus stop. The ride home took 45 minutes. May sat by the window, watching the city pass by. Tall buildings, crowded streets, people rushing home to warm apartments, and families and lives that made sense. She wondered what they would think if they knew her story. She wondered if anyone would even care. When she got home, her apartment was dark and cold. She hadn't been able to afford heating this month. She turned on a small space heater and sat down at her kitchen table. The paper keyboard was still there, taped to the surface, waiting for her like an old friend. She took the letter out of her pocket. She unfolded it and read it one more time. Your hands lack delicacy. She looked at her hands. The rough skin, the thick calluses, the fingers that had worked so hard for so long. She thought about all the floors she had scrubbed, all the beds she had made, all the heavy carts she had pushed down endless hotel hallways. These hands had done everything asked of them. They had kept her alive. They had kept her going, and they had never stopped playing. Even when there was no piano, even when there was no music, even when the whole world told her she was nothing. May placed her fingers on the paper keys. She closed her eyes, and she began to play. The room was silent. There was no sound. But in her mind, the music was deafening. It poured out of her like a river breaking through a dam. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the years of waiting. She played it all. She played until her fingers ached. She played until tears rolled down her cheeks. She played until the space heater clicked off and the cold crept back into the room. And when she finally stopped, she did not feel defeated. She felt something else. Something stronger. She looked at the letter one more time. Then she folded it up and put it back in her pocket. She didn't throw it away. She didn't tear it up. She kept it. Because one day, she was going to show them. One day, they were going to understand. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. But she knew it would happen. Because May had something that Professor Thornton and all those laughing students would never understand. She had 20 years of music living inside her. 20 years of love and loss and longing, pressed into every silent note she had ever played. And sooner or later, that music was going to find its way out. She just had to wait for the right moment. So she kept the letter. She kept practicing. And she kept showing up to class the next week, and the week after that, and the week after that. They wanted her to quit. They expected her to disappear. But May had learned a long time ago that the world doesn't give you what you deserve. You have to take it. You have to earn it. You have to fight for it in ways that nobody sees. And she was ready to fight. Nobody at the conservatory knew the truth about May. Not Professor Thornton. Not the students who laughed at her. Not anyone. They saw a quiet woman with rough hands and cheap clothes. They saw someone who didn't belong. But they never bothered to ask where she came from. They never wondered what her life had been before she walked through those doors. If they had asked, they would have learned something that would have silenced every whisper, every joke, every cruel word spoken behind her back. May had once been one of the greatest child pianists in all of China. It started when she was 4 years old. Her mother was a concert pianist in Shanghai. Not famous, but deeply talented. She had spent her whole life devoted to music. She had trained at the best schools. She had performed in concert halls across the country. And when her daughter was born, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would share everything she knew. She would pass the music down, like a gift. Their apartment in Shanghai was small, but it had one treasure: a black upright piano that sat against the wall in the main room. It was old and slightly out of tune. But to May, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. She remembered the first time her mother lifted her onto the bench. She remembered the feel of the keys under her tiny fingers, cold and smooth, full of possibility. Her mother started with simple things. Nursery rhymes, easy melodies, but it quickly became clear that May was different. She didn't just learn the notes. She felt them. She heard music in a way that most people never would. By the time she was 5, she was playing pieces meant for students twice her age. By 7, she was performing in local competitions. By 9, she had won every award there was to win. The teachers called her a prodigy. The newspapers wrote stories about her. People came from all over, just to hear her play. But May didn't care about any of that. She only cared about one thing: making her mother proud. Every night, after the lessons were done and the practicing was over, May and her mother would sit together at the piano. They would play duets. Simple pieces. Beautiful pieces. Her mother's hands moving beside hers, guiding her, teaching her, loving her through the music. Those were the happiest moments of May's life. Just the two of them. The piano, and the sound of something they had built together. When May was 10 years old, she did something that most professional pianists never attempt. She performed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. It is one of the most difficult pieces ever written. The notes come so fast and so complex that even the greatest musicians in the world struggle with it. But May played it from memory, in front of 2,000 people, without a single mistake. The audience rose to their feet. The applause went on for nearly 5 minutes. Her mother stood in the wings, tears streaming down her face. That night, everyone said the same thing. This girl was going to be one of the greatest pianists of her generation. She was going to play on the biggest stages in the world. Her future was written in gold. But life doesn't care about talent. Life doesn't care about dreams. Sometimes it just takes everything away. 1 year later, when May was 11, her father lost his job. He had worked at a factory for 15 years, and one day, without warning, it closed. There was no savings, no backup plan. The family struggled to pay rent. They struggled to buy food, and then things got worse. May's mother got sick. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away. Then came the fevers. Then the hospital visits. The doctors said it was serious. They said she needed treatment. But treatment cost money. Money they didn't have. They sold the piano first. May remembered the day the men came to take it away. She stood in the corner of the room and watched them carry it out the door. Her mother held her hand and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The piano was gone. The music was gone. Everything they had built together was being taken apart, piece by piece. The money from the piano paid for a few months of medicine. But it wasn't enough. When May was 12, her mother made a decision. They would leave China. They would go to America. There was a cousin there who could help them get started. There were better hospitals, better opportunities. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to survive. They arrived with 2 suitcases and almost nothing else. They moved into a tiny apartment in a city where they knew no one. May's mother was too sick to work. The cousin helped when he could, but he had his own family, his own problems. So May did something that no 12-year-old should have to do. She got a job. She lied about her age and started cleaning offices at night. She swept floors. She emptied trash cans. She worked in silence, while other kids her age were sleeping, dreaming, living normal lives. And every dollar she earned went to medicine, to rent, to keeping her mother alive just a little bit longer. The years passed. May grew up. She never went back to school. She never had a childhood. She moved from one cleaning job to the next. Hotels, office buildings, restaurants. Whatever paid. Her hands, once soft and delicate, became rough and hard. The calluses built up layer by layer, like armor. Her mother held on for as long as she could. She fought the sickness with everything she had. But some fights cannot be won. She passed away when May was 19 years old. On her last night, May sat beside her bed and held her hand. The room was quiet. The machines beeped softly. Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Don't stop playing," she said. "Promise me. No matter what happens, don't ever stop." May promised. She held her mother's hand and promised through her tears. And then, a few hours later, she was gone. After the funeral, May went back to their tiny apartment. She sat alone in the silence. There was no piano. There hadn't been one for years. But she needed to play. She needed to feel close to her mother one more time. So she found a piece of paper, a long, blank sheet, and she drew a keyboard. Every key, every black and white rectangle, just like the piano they used to share. She placed her fingers on the paper, and she played. No sound came out. But she didn't need sound. She could hear the music in her head. She could feel her mother sitting beside her, guiding her hands, just like she used to. From that night on, May never stopped. She practiced on that paper keyboard every single day. For 13 years. Through every job, every hardship, every moment of loneliness. She kept the music alive inside her because it was all she had left of her mother. It was all she had left of herself. The students at the conservatory thought she was a beginner. They thought she was a cleaning lady with delusions of talent. Professor Thornton thought she had no natural ability, no feel for music, no future at the piano. They were all wrong. May had been playing longer than most of them had been alive. She had performed pieces they couldn't even dream of attempting. She had carried a gift inside her for 20 years, protected it, nurtured it, kept it burning through the darkest times. And now, sitting in that classroom, listening to their laughter, reading their cruel evaluations, she held on to one single truth. Her mother had asked her to never stop playing, and she never had. Not once, not ever. The music was still there. Waiting. Ready. All it needed was a chance to be heard. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted. The trees began to bloom. And inside the conservatory, there was only one thing anyone could talk about: the annual showcase. It was the biggest event of the year. Every student in the program would perform in front of a live audience. Teachers, donors, music critics, and industry professionals would fill the grand concert hall. Careers could be made in a single evening. One good performance could open doors that stayed closed forever for everyone else. One bad performance could end a dream before it even began. But for May, there was no performance. Professor Thornton had not assigned her a slot. He had forgotten about her completely. Or maybe he just didn't think she was worth remembering. Either way, her name was not on the list. She was not expected to play. She was not expected to do anything at all. She still came to the rehearsals. She still sat in the back of the room and watched the other students prepare. She listened to them play their pieces over and over again. She watched Professor Thornton give them advice, correct their posture, praise their progress, and she said nothing. She just watched. The young man whose family had donated money to the conservatory was the star of the program. Everyone knew it. He had been given the most prestigious slot of the evening, 15 minutes to perform a complicated piece by Liszt. It was a flashy, impressive composition designed to show off technical skill. He practiced it constantly, and he made sure everyone knew how good he was. "This is going to change everything for me," he told a group of students one afternoon. "I've already got agents asking about me. This performance is just the beginning." May heard him. She looked at his hands. Soft, smooth, perfect. The hands of someone who had never worked a day in his life. The hands of someone who had been given everything and earned nothing. She looked down at her own hands. Rough, calloused, scarred from years of hard labor. But beneath the surface, those hands held something his never would. 20 years of music, 20 years of love, 20 years of a promise she had never broken. The night of the showcase arrived. The concert hall was filled with people. Hundreds of them. They wore expensive clothes and spoke in hushed, important voices. The chandeliers sparkled overhead. The stage was set with a single grand piano, polished and gleaming under the lights. It was the most beautiful instrument May had ever seen. She stood in the back of the hall, near the doors. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't a performer tonight. But she couldn't stay away. She had to see it. She had to be close to the music, even if she couldn't be part of it. The performances began. One by one, the students took the stage. Some played well. Some played beautifully. The audience clapped politely, After each piece, Professor Thornton sat in the front row, nodding approvingly at his best students. And then, about halfway through the evening, something happened. A staff member rushed up to Professor Thornton and whispered something in his ear. His face changed. He stood up quickly and walked backstage. A few minutes later, word spread through the hall. The star student was sick. Food poisoning, they said. He had eaten something bad at dinner and could barely stand. There was no way he could perform. His 15-minute slot was empty. The showcase had a hole in it that no one knew how to fill. Backstage, Professor Thornton was panicking. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his silver hair. The donors were watching. The critics were watching. He couldn't just skip 15 minutes of the program. He needed someone to fill the slot. Anyone. He looked around at the students backstage. Most of them had already performed. The others weren't ready. They didn't have pieces prepared. They couldn't just go out there and play something unrehearsed. And then his eyes landed on May. She was standing in the corner, quiet as always. She had slipped backstage without anyone noticing. She just wanted to be closer to the piano. Closer to the music. Professor Thornton stared at her. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. "You," he said, walking toward her. "Can you play anything? Anything at all?" May looked at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes. She saw the way he was asking her, not because he believed in her, but because he had no other choice. She was his last resort. A joke, a placeholder. She should have said no. She should have walked away and let him figure it out himself. After everything he had done, after every cruel word and dismissive glance, she owed him nothing. But this wasn't about him. This was about her mother. This was about the promise. This was about 20 years of silence, finally finding a voice. "Yes," she said quietly. "I can play something." Professor Thornton blinked. He hadn't expected her to say yes. He didn't know what to do with it. "Fine," he said, waving his hand. "Go. Play whatever you want. Just fill the time." "Fine." He walked away, already preparing his apology to the judges. He expected her to embarrass herself. He expected the audience to sit through 15 minutes of painful, clumsy playing from a woman who had no business being on that stage. He had no idea what was about to happen. May walked out onto the stage. The lights were blinding. The audience was a sea of shadows beyond the glare. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. Watching. Waiting. Judging. She walked slowly toward the piano. Her worn shoes made soft sounds on the polished wood floor. Her gray sweater looked out of place in this world of silk and velvet. She heard a few murmurs from the audience. She heard someone whisper. She sat down on the bench. The piano was cold and smooth under her fingertips. Real keys, real hammers, real strings. For the first time in 20 years, she was sitting in front of a real piano. She closed her eyes. She thought about her mother. She thought about their tiny apartment in Shanghai. She thought about the old upright piano against the wall. She thought about all those nights playing duets, side by side, the music flowing between them like a conversation. She thought about the promise. Don't stop playing. No matter what happens, don't ever stop. She opened her eyes, and she began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto, No. 3, rang out through the concert hall. For a moment, there was confusion. People looked at each other. This was one of the most difficult pieces ever written. No one played this without months of preparation. No one played this from memory. No one played this unless they were a master. But Mai played. Her rough, calloused fingers moved across the keys like water, like wind, like something that had been held back for 20 years and was finally free. The music poured out of her. Every note, every chord, every impossible passage that made professional pianists tremble. She didn't think. She didn't try. She just played. The audience went silent. No one moved. No one breathed. They just listened. Professor Thornton stood frozen at the edge of the stage. His face had gone pale. His mouth hung open. He couldn't understand what he was hearing. This was impossible. This was a woman he had written off as talentless. A woman whose hands he had called unfit for music. But those hands were doing something miraculous. In the front row, there was a woman with silver hair and sharp, knowing eyes. Her name was Maestro Elena Voss. She was one of the greatest living pianists in the world. She had performed on every major stage. She had heard every great musician of her generation, and as she listened to May play, tears began to roll down her face. She rose slowly to her feet. One by one, others stood with her. By the time May played the final note, the entire audience was standing. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. And then, the concert hall exploded with applause. May sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys. She wasn't thinking about the audience. She wasn't thinking about Professor Thornton or the students who had laughed at her. She was thinking about her mother. And somewhere deep inside, she could feel her smiling. The applause would not stop. It rolled through the concert hall like thunder. It echoed off the walls and the ceiling and filled every corner of that grand room. People were on their feet. Some were crying. Some were shouting. Some just stood there with their hands pressed together, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. May sat at the piano. Her fingers still rested on the keys. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the heat of the stage lights on her face. But she did not move. She did not stand. She just sat there, letting the moment wash over her. 20 years. 20 years of silence. 20 years of practicing on paper. Of pressing keys that made no sound. Of keeping a promise that no one else knew about. And now, finally, the music had found its way out. She thought about her mother. She thought about all those nights in their tiny apartment in Shanghai. She thought about the old piano against the wall. She thought about the last words her mother ever spoke to her. Don't stop playing. No matter what happens, don't ever stop. She hadn't. Not once. Not ever. And now, the whole world knew. The applause finally began to fade. People sat back down, still whispering to each other, still shaking their heads in disbelief. But one person did not sit. One person walked straight toward the stage. Maestro Elena Voss. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and eyes that had seen everything the world of music had to offer. She had performed with the greatest orchestras. She had trained the finest pianists. She had heard talent in every form it could take. But tonight, something had touched her in a way she had not felt in years. She walked up the steps to the stage. She walked past the other students, past the staff members, past Professor Thornton, who stood frozen like a statue. She walked straight to May. May looked up at her. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do. She had never imagined this moment. She had never let herself dream this far. The maestro stopped in front of her. For a long moment, she said nothing. She just looked at May with those sharp, knowing eyes. Then, she spoke. "Where have you been hiding?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. But May heard every word. She didn't know how to answer. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. All the years of silence, all the years of being invisible, they had taken something from her. She had forgotten how to speak about herself. She had forgotten how to let anyone see her. But the maestro waited. She didn't rush. She didn't push. She just waited. And slowly, quietly, May began to talk. She told her everything. She told her about Shanghai, about her mother, about the competitions and the concerts, and the night she played Rachmaninoff for 2,000 people when she was only 10 years old. She told her about her father losing his job, about her mother getting sick, about selling the piano and moving to America with nothing. She told her about working as a cleaner since she was 12, about the hotels and the office buildings, and the endless hours of scrubbing and lifting and carrying. She told her about her mother's death. about the promise she made, about the paper keyboard she had drawn on her kitchen table. She told her about practicing every night for 13 years, on keys that made no sound, about keeping the music alive inside her when there was no one to hear it, about coming to the conservatory and being laughed at, looked down on, written off as nothing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The evaluation letter. She handed it to the maestro without a word. The maestro read it. Her face changed. Something flickered in her eyes. Anger, sadness, disbelief. She looked at the letter for a long time. Then she looked back at May. "Your hands lack delicacy," she read aloud. She shook her head slowly. "The person who wrote this has no idea what they're talking about." She turned and looked at Professor Thornton. He was still standing at the edge of the stage. His face was pale. His hands were trembling. He couldn't meet her eyes. The maestro didn't say anything to him. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. She turned back to May. "I want you to come study with me," she said. "In Vienna. Full scholarship. Everything paid for. You belong on the greatest stages in the world. And I'm going to make sure you get there. Action reflected. Action reflected. Action reflected." May stared at her. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. This wasn't possible. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. People who cleaned hotel rooms. People who practiced on paper. People who had been told their whole lives that they weren't good enough. But it was happening. It was real. "I don't know what to say," May whispered. The maestro smiled. It was a warm smile, a kind smile. "Say yes," she said. May felt the tears coming. She tried to hold them back, but she couldn't. They spilled down her cheeks, one after another, falling onto the polished wood of the piano bench. "Yes," she said. The news spread fast. Within days, May's story was everywhere. Someone in the audience had recorded her performance on their phone. They posted it online. It went viral. Millions of people watched the video of a quiet woman in a gray sweater sitting down at a piano and playing like an angel. They read about her life. They learned about her mother. They cried over the paper keyboard. The conservatory issued a formal apology. They said they had made a mistake. They said they were sorry. But May didn't care about apologies. She didn't care about revenge or recognition or proving anyone wrong. That had never been what this was about. Professor Thornton never spoke to her again. She saw him once, in the hallway, a few days after the showcase. He looked at her for a moment, then looked away, and kept walking. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel satisfied. She just felt tired. Tired of being judged by people who never bothered to see her. The students who had laughed at her were quiet now. The young man who had called her names couldn't even look at her. They had all seen the truth. They had all heard what those rough, calloused hands could do. There was nothing left to say. 2 months later, May boarded a plane to Vienna. She sat by the window and watched the city disappear beneath the clouds. She thought about everything she was leaving behind. The tiny apartment, the hotel job, the paper keyboard on her kitchen table. She was leaving all of it, but she was taking one thing with her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph. It was old and worn at the edges. The colors had faded over the years, but the image was still clear. It was her mother, sitting at a piano, smiling. May held the photograph in her hands. She looked at her mother's face. She looked at her mother's fingers, resting on the keys. She remembered all those nights they had played together, all those duets, all that love, passed down through the music. She pressed the photograph against her heart. "I kept practicing, Mama," she whispered. "Every single day. Just like I promised. I never stopped." She looked out the window at the endless sky. "And now I'm going to play for the whole world." The plane climbed higher. The clouds stretched out beneath her like a sea of white. And somewhere inside May, in that place where the music lived, She felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer silent. She was no longer the quiet woman with rough hands that no one believed in. She was a pianist, and her fingers had finally told the truth.